February 13, 1929, Al Capone was America's favorite gangster, not its most feared, its favorite. The man who made bootlegging glamorous, who threw parties where champagne flowed like water, who tipped waitresses $100 and opened speakeasies where ordinary people could drink, dance, and forget the dreariness of prohibition. He was 30 years old at the height of his power, and the newspapers loved him almost as much as they loved writing about him. Scarface Al, they called him, but with a strange kind of affection. The scar across his left cheek, 3 parallel lines from a bar fight years ago, had become iconic, a symbol of his authenticity. He wasn't some politician or businessman pretending to be tough. He was the real thing, and Americans in the 1920s, tired of Prohibition's hypocrisy and the Depression's approach, found something appealing in that realness. He was Robin Hood in a silk suit, taking from the government that had banned alcohol and giving to the people who wanted to drink. The speakeasies he controlled weren't dangerous dens of vice. They were glamorous clubs where jazz played, where flappers danced, where ordinary people could feel sophisticated and daring. He donated to charities, opened soup kitchens for the poor, showed up at hospitals to pay medical bills for struggling families. He attended boxing matches and baseball games, and the crowds cheered when they saw him, waving and calling his name like he was a movie star. Children asked for his autograph. Society women wanted to be photographed with him. When he walked into restaurants, he'd pick up the check for everyone dining there. "Let them eat," he'd say, waving off the thanks. "What's money?" For if not to make people happy, the newspapers ate it up, feature stories about his generosity, photos of him smiling, always smiling, that confident grin that said he knew the rules didn't apply to him and didn't care. Capone feeds hundreds, the headlines would read, or Scarface Al pays hospital bill for injured child. For every story about violence, there were 3 about charity. The violence, well, that was just business. Gang wars, territorial disputes, the kind of thing that happened in the underworld but didn't touch regular people. Capone never hurt civilians. That was his rule, his code, the thing that separated him from common thugs. He was a businessman who happened to work in an illegal industry, and America, in its strange relationship with Prohibition, had decided that made him more folk hero than criminal. "I give the public what the public wants," Capone said in interviews, and it was hard to argue with him. Prohibition was unpopular. The government had banned alcohol, but people still wanted to drink. Capone provided that service, and he did it with style, with generosity, with a kind of working-class charm that made him relatable despite his wealth. On February 13, 1929, Capone was in Miami, Florida, at his Palm Island estate, enjoying the sunshine and planning his next moves. Chicago was cold in February, and he'd learned to spend winters in warmer climates. His men were handling things back home. Everything was under control. He had no idea that in less than 24 hours, everything he'd built, the image, the charm, the public affection, would be destroyed so completely that 60 years later, when people heard his name, they'd think first of blood, not bootlegging. February 14, 1929, Valentine's Day. At 10:30 a.m., 7 men gathered in a garage at 2122 North Clark Street in Chicago. It was a front for the North Side Gang, run by Bugs Moran, one of Capone's most persistent rivals. The men were waiting for a shipment of hijacked whiskey, chatting, smoking, unaware that death was pulling up to the curb in a police car. 4 men got out, 2 in police uniforms, 2 in civilian clothes. They entered the garage and ordered the 7 men inside to line up against the wall. The North Side Gang members complied without resistance. They thought it was a police raid, something routine, something they'd pay their way out of later. They were used to it. They were still facing the wall when the Thompson submachine guns opened fire. 70 rounds in 90 seconds. The sound was deafening. Mechanical, industrial. When it stopped, 7 men lay dead or dying in spreading pools of blood. One of them, Frank Gusenberg, lived long enough to be transported to the hospital. When the police asked who shot him, he gave the answer that would become legendary in its defiance: "Nobody shot me." He died 3 hours later. The killers walked out calmly, the 2 civilians with their hands up as if being arrested by the 2 police officers, completing the deception for anyone watching. They drove away in the fake police car and vanished into Chicago's morning traffic. By noon, the news was everywhere. By evening, it was the only story in America. And by midnight, Al Capone had gone from America's favorite gangster to its most hated criminal. Capone was at the Miami racetrack when he heard the news. An aide pulled him aside, whispered. Urgently, Capone's face went blank, that careful mask he wore when he didn't want anyone to see what he was thinking. 7, he said quietly. Yes, boss, all of them, against the wall. Capone was silent for a long moment, then get me to a phone, now. The garage massacre bore all the hallmarks of a Capone operation, the precision, the audacity, the fake police uniforms. But Capone hadn't ordered it. He'd wanted more and dealt with, yes, but not like this. Not 7 men executed like it was a firing squad. Not on Valentine's Day, a detail that would make the story even more macabre in the public imagination. But here was the problem. Even if Capone hadn't ordered it, it was his organization, his men, his responsibility, and more importantly, it was his reputation. For years, he'd cultivated the image of the gangster. With standards, the criminal with a code. He hurt rivals, not civilians. He was violent but discriminating, professional. 7 men lined up and machine-gunned to death wasn't discriminating. It wasn't professional. It was a massacre. And the newspapers were already calling it exactly that, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Capone spent the rest of the day trying to establish an alibi, calling witnesses who could confirm he'd been in Miami all morning. He called his lawyers in Chicago, demanded they prepare a statement. He paced his estate, smoking cigar after cigar, watching the sun set over the ocean and knowing that back in Chicago, everything was falling apart. That night he called his wife me. It's bad, he told her. It's really bad this time. Did you do it? She asked. There was a pause. Then, does it matter? They're going to say I did. He was right. The newspapers the next morning were brutal. Not in condemning Capone, they'd done that before, but in the tone. The affection was gone. The romanticizing was over. This wasn't bootlegging or territorial disputes or even murder in the context of gang warfare. This was cold-blooded execution. This was 7 men, some of them mechanics and truck drivers who happened to be in the wrong place, slaughtered like animals. The Chicago Tribune ran the photos. Crime scene investigators had taken them. 7 bodies against a brick wall, blood pooled on the concrete floor, the wall pockmarked with bullet holes. The images were graphic, shocking, impossible to romanticize. This was what Capone's Chicago looked like when you stopped focusing on the parties and the speakeasies and actually looked at the violence. Public opinion shifted overnight. The people who'd cheered for Capone at baseball games now called him a monster. The society women who'd wanted photographs now wanted distance. The newspapers that had made him a celebrity now made him public enemy number 1, literally. The Chicago Crime Commission, established specifically to combat organized crime, designated him as such in an official statement. Al Capone, public enemy number 1. It was the first time that phrase had been used. It would stick for the rest of his life. Capone returned to Chicago a week later, and the difference was immediate and total. The crowds that used to gather when he appeared in public now scattered. The police, who'd once looked the other way for the right price, now harassed him constantly. His favorite restaurants suddenly couldn't seat him, his usual table at the opera was empty because patrons complained. They're treating me like I'm a monster, Capone said to Jake Guzik one night in his office at the Lexington Hotel. Like I personally pulled the triggers. Boss, 7 men on Valentine's Day. They lined them up and, I know, Capone interrupted, his voice sharp, then quieter. I know what they did, but I didn't order it. Did you try to stop it? Capone didn't answer that. Because the truth was more complicated. He'd wanted more and dead, had said as much, had told his men to handle it. But he hadn't specified how, hadn't asked for details, had maintained plausible deniability in case something went wrong. Now something had gone very wrong, and the deniability didn't matter because the public had already made up its mind. Al Capone had crossed a line, and in crossing he'd transformed from lovable rogue to genuine threat. Capone tried everything to rehabilitate his image. In the fall of 1930, as the Great Depression hit and unemployment soared, he opened soup kitchens in Chicago. Not 1 or 2, dozens of them all across the city, serving free food to anyone who needed it. Thousands of people lined up every day, and Capone made sure the newspapers knew he was footing the bill. The first one opened on South State Street on Thanksgiving Day, 1930. Capone himself showed up for the opening, wearing one of his expensive suits, standing beside a long table laden with turkey, potatoes, bread, and vegetables. Photographers captured him serving plates to grateful families, men who'd lost their jobs, women with hungry children, elderly people with nowhere else to turn. Nobody's going hungry in my city, he declared. Publicly looking directly into the cameras, The government isn't helping these people, so I will. I don't care what they say about me. I don't care what they write. These people need food, and I'm going to give it to them. The lines stretched for blocks, 3,000 meals a day, sometimes more. Men who'd worked factory jobs until last year now stood in line with tin cups, accepting charity from a gangster. Mothers brought their children, and Capone made sure there was extra for the kids, candy, toys at Christmas, whatever he could provide. For a brief moment it worked. Desperate families praised him, genuinely grateful. Some of them cried when they received their meals, overwhelmed by simple kindness in a time of crushing hardship. Headlines called him a modern Robin Hood again, the gangster with a heart, the man who cared about common people when their own government had abandoned them. Mr. Capone saved my family, one woman told a reporter, tears streaming down her face. My husband lost his job 6 months ago. We had nothing, and Mr. Capone, he fed us. He didn't have to, but he did. Capone read those testimonials, collected them, showed them to his lawyers and associates as evidence that the public could forgive, could forget. You see, he'd say, they know who I really am. They know I'm not the monster the papers made me out to be. But the praise rang hollow, calculated. Everyone knew why he was doing it, to rehabilitate the image shattered by the Valentine's Day massacre. And that knowledge poisoned the gesture, turned generosity into manipulation, charity into public relations. He's feeding people with blood money. 1. Editorial read: every sandwich comes with the memory of 7 men executed against a wall. Every bowl of soup is seasoned with the understanding that this isn't kindness, it's image management. Al Capone isn't feeding the hungry because he cares about them. He's feeding them because he needs us to forget what he is. Other newspapers were more blunt. Capone's soup kitchens, charity or calculated campaign, asked the Tribune. The article detailed the costs, thousands of dollars per day, and questioned where that money came from. Bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, protection rackets. Every meal served was funded by crime, and that taint couldn't be washed away no matter how many grateful families accepted the food. The government made sure people understood that connection. Federal prosecutors gave statements reminding the public that Capone was under investigation for tax evasion, that his charitable spending was likely funded by illegal operations, that accepting his charity was, in some moral sense, accepting the fruits of organized crime. Would you take food from a man who ordered 7 men machine-gunned to death? One prosecutor asked in a press conference. Would you feel good about eating a meal paid for with money from illegal gambling and prostitution? That's what Capone's charity is. Don't let hunger blind you to what he is. Capone attended charity events, donated to orphanages, showed up at hospitals. He gave interviews where he talked about wanting to go legitimate, about how he was just a businessman providing a service people wanted, about how the real criminals were the politicians who'd imposed prohibition in the first place. None of it mattered. The image of those 7 bodies wouldn't fade. Every time someone started to soften toward Capone, someone else would mention Valentine's Day and the sympathy would evaporate. The federal government smelled blood in the water. Elliot Ness and his untouchables intensified their raids. The IRS began building their tax evasion case. Politicians who'd once taken Capone's money now publicly denounced him. The protection he'd bought, the alliances he'd built, the network of corruption that had kept him safe, it all started to crumble. And Capone, for the first time in his career, felt something he hadn't felt since he was a teenager in Brooklyn: fear. By 1931, 2 years after the massacre, Capone was facing federal charges for tax evasion. His lawyers told him the government's case was strong. His accountants told him they'd found evidence going back years. His allies told him to prepare for prison time. How did this happen? Capone asked Frank Nitti during one of their strategy sessions. How did we go from running this city to this? Nitti looked at him with unusual frankness. February 14, 1929. That wasn't it doesn't matter if you ordered it, Al. It happened under your watch, your organization, your reputation, and the public never forgave you for it. Capone was silent because Nitti was right and they both knew it. The Valentine's Day massacre had been the turning point, the moment when the public's tolerance for romantic gangsterism had collided with the reality of what that actually meant. 7 men dead in a garage, machine-gunned to death, and suddenly all the champagne and charity didn't matter anymore. In October 1931, Al Capone was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. As they led him out of the courtroom, reporters shouted questions about the Valentine's Day massacre. Even then, 2 years later, it was still the story they wanted to talk about. I didn't order it, Capone shouted back, his composure finally cracking. I was in Miami, I was, but his voice was drowned out by the crowd and the camera shutters, and the words vanished into history unsaid, unheard, and ultimately irrelevant. Because the truth didn't matter anymore, the image did, and the image was set in blood on a garage floor in Chicago. Al Capone spent the next 11 years in prison, first at Atlanta, then Alcatraz, where neurosyphilis ravaged his mind until he was released as a shell of his former self. He died in 1947, largely forgotten except as a cautionary tale. But the St. Valentine's Day massacre lived on. It became the defining moment of Prohibition-era crime, the image everyone thought of when they thought of gangsters. Textbooks included the crime scene photos. Movies recreated the scene with increasing drama. The garage itself became a tourist attraction, people posing outside the building where 7 men had died. And Al Capone, who'd tried so hard to be America's charming gangster, became America's most notorious murderer. The irony wasn't lost on the few people who'd known him before the massacre. Frank Nitti, before he died, told a reporter, "Al wanted to be loved, he really did. He thought you could be a gangster and still be beloved if you did it with style. The massacre taught him you couldn't, taught all of us. The public will tolerate a lot, but not that. Was Capone responsible?" Legally, the connection was never proven. No one was ever convicted of the massacre. The killers, if they were Capone's men, took the secret to their graves. But in the court of public opinion, the verdict was immediate and final: guilty. And unlike tax evasion, there was no appeal for crimes against image, no pardon for falling from grace. Once the public turned on you, they never turned back. Al Capone learned that lesson on February 14, 1929. Or more accurately, in the 24 hours that followed, when hero became villain, when charm became cruelty, when the man who'd been America's favorite gangster became its most hated criminal. Some transformations happen gradually. Some happen in a single moment of violence that changes everything. For Al Capone, 7 bodies in a garage changed everything, and no amount of soup kitchens could ever wash away that blood.